Taryn Holloway had stopped asking questions 3 hours ago. There was no point anymore. Her Aunt Beatrice hadn't answered a single one since dragging her out of the house at 11 that night. Coat thrown over her shoulders, phone yanked out of her hand before she could call anyone. Now they were standing in an unlit driveway on the edge of a suburban Boston neighborhood, gravel crunching under 3 black SUVs that looked like they belonged to a different world than the one Taryn had grown up in. "Aunt B, please, just tell me what's happening." Quiet. Beatrice's voice was sharp enough to cut. She was gripping a folder of papers so tightly her knuckles had gone white, and her eyes kept darting toward the lead vehicle like she was waiting for something, or someone. The back door of the SUV opened. A man stepped out first. Tall, unhurried, dressed in a dark coat that fit him the way expensive things always seemed to fit people who never had to think about money. He didn't look at Beatrice. He didn't look at the papers she was already thrusting toward him. His eyes went straight to Taryn, and for a second, she felt like the only person standing in that driveway. "This is her," Beatrice said quickly, stepping forward. "This is Taryn. I told you, she's healthy, she's capable, she'll work hard, she just needs Ms. Holloway." He said it to Taryn, not to Beatrice, and something about the way he used her name, calm and direct, made her stomach twist. "My name is Caspian Hayes. I need you to trust me for the next few minutes, even though I understand you have no reason to." "Trust you for what?" Taryn's voice cracked. "Someone needs to tell me what's going on. Right now." Beatrice tried to answer, tried to shove the folder into his hands, babbling about the loan and the deadline and how she'd already signed over what he'd asked for, but Caspian didn't so much as glance at her. He walked past Beatrice entirely, like she wasn't there, like the folder in her hands meant nothing to him in that moment, and he stopped in front of Taryn. Up close, she could see he wasn't much older than her, late 20s maybe. There was nothing cruel in his face, no sneer, no cold amusement at her expense, and that confused her more than anything else that night. She'd braced herself for something ugly. She got something else instead, a steadiness that didn't match anything Beatrice had told her to expect. "You're cold," he said, and before she could respond, he was shrugging out of his own coat and settling it over her shoulders. It was heavy and warm and smelled faintly of cedar, and Taryn stood there frozen, too stunned to shrug it off. "I don't understand," she whispered. "My aunt said, she said I was being handed over, like property, like I owed someone something. You don't owe anyone anything." His voice didn't rise, didn't soften into something fake either. It was just steady. "Not tonight, and not going forward. Get in the car. It's warm, and there's someone waiting to make sure you're comfortable. I'm not getting in a car with strangers. I know how that sounds." For the first time, something flickered across his face. Not impatience, but understanding, like he'd expected exactly this reaction and respected it. "I'm not going to force you. But your aunt's debts are the reason 3 men are standing behind me right now, and I'd rather you were somewhere safe while I finish settling this than standing in a driveway at midnight." Behind him, 2 of his men were already moving toward Beatrice, murmuring something about paperwork, about signatures, about a deadline that had apparently already passed. Beatrice's face had gone pale, and for the first time since dragging Taryn out of the house, she looked less like someone in control and more like someone who'd made a terrible miscalculation. "Beatrice," Taryn's voice shook. "What did you do?" "I did what I had to do." Beatrice wouldn't meet her eyes. "You'll be fine. He's not like the others I talked to. Just go with him." That was the moment it hit Taryn, cold and sudden, that whatever was happening tonight had been decided long before she'd been dragged out of bed. Her aunt hadn't brought her here to negotiate. She'd brought her here to trade her, like a debt paid in a currency Taryn hadn't agreed to. She looked back at Caspian. He hadn't moved, hadn't rushed her, hadn't so much as raised his voice the entire time, and there was something in his patience that unsettled her more than shouting would have. "Why does it matter to you if I'm comfortable?" she asked quietly. "You could just take whatever she's offering and let your men handle the rest. Because you didn't ask for any of this." He held the car door open, waiting. "And because there's more to tonight than your aunt understands. I'll explain everything, but not standing in a cold driveway at midnight." Taryn glanced once more at Beatrice, who was already turning away, already talking to one of the men about signatures and releases, like Taryn's future was a line item to be finalized. Something in her chest went hollow. Whatever safety she'd imagined she had, whatever family loyalty she thought still existed between her and the woman who'd raised her since her father died, had just evaporated in a gravel driveway in the middle of the night. She pulled the coat tighter around her shoulders and stepped into the car. Behind her, she heard Caspian's voice, low and final, speaking to his men. "Get her settled, and get every one of Beatrice Holloway's remaining debts on my desk by morning." The door closed, the engine started, and Taryn Holloway left behind everything she'd known, with no idea that the man beside her had been waiting years for a chance to repay a debt her aunt knew nothing about. The city thinned out behind them until there was nothing but dark trees and the occasional glow of a gas station sign cutting through the night. Taryn sat with her hands folded in her lap, still wrapped in Caspian's coat, watching the highway markers blur past. Interstate 95 North. She didn't even know where they were headed, and for a while she was too exhausted to ask. Caspian sat across from her, not beside her, giving her space she hadn't expected. He'd been quiet since the car pulled away from the driveway, occasionally glancing at his phone, occasionally exchanging a few low words with the driver up front. It was almost 2 in the morning by the time he finally reached into a small cooler bag near his feet and pulled out a thermos and a wrapped sandwich. "You should eat something," he said, holding both out to her. "It's a long drive. I'm not hungry. You haven't eaten since dinner, and that was hours before your aunt pulled you out of bed." He set the thermos down on the console between them, instead of pushing it on her. "It'll be there, if you change your mind." Taryn stared at the thermos for a long moment. The steam curling off the cap smelled like cocoa, not coffee, and something about that small detail that he'd noticed, or asked someone to prepare something warm and simple instead of whatever a stranger might assume a distressed 23-year-old would want, cracked something loose in her chest. She reached for it before she could stop herself. "Where are we going?" she asked, wrapping both hands around the warmth. "Maine, a property I own outside Rockport." He watched her carefully, like he was gauging how much she could take in at once. "It's quiet there. Private. Nobody will bother you." "You keep saying things like that. Private, safe, comfortable." Her voice wavered, but she pushed through it. "You still haven't told me why any of this is happening." "I will. Not tonight. You're running on no sleep and too much fear, and I don't want to explain something this important while you're too tired to really hear it." He paused. "But I can tell you what tonight isn't. You are not a prisoner. Nobody in that car intends to hurt you, and as of about 20 minutes ago, your aunt no longer has any legal authority over you or your affairs." Taryn blinked. "What do you mean, no legal authority?" "I mean exactly that. Whatever guardianship or financial control she claimed she had, verbal or otherwise, ends tonight. My lawyers are drawing up the paperwork as we speak. By morning, there won't be a document in existence that ties your name to any debt she's taken on, past or future. She's owed people money for years. I knew that. I didn't know she was borrowing against— Taryn stopped herself, throat tightening. Against me. Like I was collateral. She was. Caspian's jaw tightened. Just slightly. The first real crack in his composure since the driveway. Which is one of several reasons I intend to make sure she never gets the chance to do it to anyone else. The SUV hit a stretch of rougher road, and Taryn gripped the thermos tighter to keep it from spilling. Outside, the trees had grown denser, the exits farther apart. She glanced at the driver's rearview mirror, catching a flash of his eyes checking the road behind them, then ahead, then back again, like he was watching for something more than traffic. Is someone following us? No. Caspian's answer came quick and even. But your aunt owed money to more than one party, and not all of them are as patient as I am. My team is simply being careful. That did nothing to settle her nerves, but there was something almost reassuring in his honesty. He wasn't pretending the night was ordinary. He wasn't dressing it up as some polite favor between old family friends. He was letting her see exactly how serious it was, which somehow made her trust him a little more than if he'd smiled and told her everything was fine. His phone buzzed against his knee. He glanced at the screen, and for a moment his expression sharpened into something colder, more businesslike. The version of him she imagined ran whatever operation had 3 armored SUVs and a team willing to intercept a woman in a driveway at midnight. "Everything all right?" she asked, surprising herself by caring enough to ask. One of Beatrice's other creditors is asking questions about the property transfer we settled tonight. He typed something quickly, then set the phone face down. "Nothing that concerns you. I'm making sure it stays that way. You keep saying that it doesn't concern me. But it feels like everything happening right now is about me." "It is about you," he admitted, meeting her eyes directly for the first time since they'd gotten in the car. "Just not in the way your aunt made it seem tonight. She thought she was handing off a debt. She had no idea what she was actually walking into." Taryn wanted to ask what that meant, wanted to demand answers right there on the dark highway with nothing but pine trees and mile markers rushing past the windows, but exhaustion was pulling at her harder than curiosity now, and the warmth of the cocoa had settled something jittery in her chest. She sipped from the thermos slowly, watching Caspian's profile in the dim cabin light, trying to reconcile the calm, careful man beside her with the version of tonight her aunt had prepared her for. Somewhere past Portsmouth, her eyes grew heavy despite everything. The last thing she registered before sleep pulled her under was Caspian quietly instructing the driver to slow down, to take the coastal route instead of the highway exit, so the last hour of the drive would be gentler. She didn't see the small, folded photograph he pulled from his coat pocket a few minutes later, an old picture of a man she'd never met, standing beside a younger version of Caspian's father, both of them smiling outside a modest hardware store that no longer existed. Taryn woke to the sound of gulls. For a moment, she didn't move, didn't open her eyes, caught in that strange fog between sleep and waking, where nothing feels quite real. Then she felt the unfamiliar softness of a car seat beneath her, the weight of Caspian's coat still draped over her shoulders, and the previous night came rushing back all at once. The driveway, Beatrice's folder of papers, the long dark highway. She sat up slowly. Outside the window, the world had changed completely. Gone were the pine trees and empty exits of the highway. In their place stood tall iron gates, swinging open onto a gravel drive, and beyond that, perched on a rocky outcrop, overlooking water so blue it looked painted, sat a house unlike anything Taryn had ever seen in person. Stone walls softened by climbing ivy, dark shutters, and behind it all, nothing but open ocean stretching to the horizon. "Rockport," Caspian said quietly, watching her reaction. "We're here. This is yours?" "It was my grandfather's, originally. I spend most weekends here when work allows it." He said it simply, without any of the boastfulness she might have expected from a man who apparently owned fleets of SUVs and settled six-figure debts before breakfast. "You'll be staying in the East Wing. It has its own entrance if you'd rather not use the main house." The car rolled to a stop in front of wide stone steps, and before Taryn could gather her bearings, the front door opened and a woman appeared, silver-haired, dressed simply but neatly, wiping her hands on an apron like she'd been in the middle of something in the kitchen. "This is Mrs. Gable," Caspian said, stepping out first and offering Taryn his hand. "She manages the house. Anything you need, she'll know how to find it." Mrs. Gable's eyes softened the moment she saw Taryn, no judgment in them, no curiosity about why a stranger had arrived at 8 in the morning, wrapped in Mr. Hayes's coat. "You must be exhausted, dear. Come in, come in. I've got tea on and a room ready." Taryn let herself be guided up the steps, still disoriented, still half convinced she'd wake up back in her own bed and discover the entire night had been some fevered dream. But the stone was real beneath her feet, and the smell of the ocean was real, sharp and clean, and the warmth radiating from the house's open door was real too. Inside, the manor was less imposing than its exterior suggested. High ceilings, yes, and furniture that looked older than Taryn's entire life, but there were also soft throw blankets tossed over the backs of chairs, and a fire already crackling in a hearth despite the mild morning, and none of it felt like the cold, sterile wealth she'd imagined belonged to a man who traveled with armed men and settled debts in driveways. "Your room's just this way," Mrs. Gable said, leading her down a long hallway lined with windows. Every few steps, the ocean reappeared, framed differently each time, until they reached a door at the end of the corridor. Mrs. Gable pushed it open. The suite beyond took Taryn's breath away. A wide bed dressed in pale linen sat beneath a window that looked directly out over the cliffs, the water beyond catching the morning light in 1,000 shifting colors. There was a small sitting area near a second window, a private bathroom she could see through an open door, and everything about the space felt deliberately chosen rather than randomly assigned to a guest who might not even stay the week. "This is too much," Taryn said quietly. "I don't understand why he's doing any of this." "That's not really mine to explain, dear." Mrs. Gable set a folded robe at the foot of the bed. "But I've worked for that man 11 years, and I've never once seen him go out of his way for someone the way he has for you since last night. Whatever his reasons, they're not small ones." Taryn didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing, and Mrs. Gable, sensing the exhaustion still pulling at her, didn't push. "Rest as long as you need. There's no schedule here, no one expecting anything of you. When you're ready, come find the kitchen. I'll have something warm waiting." The door clicked shut, and for the first time since Beatrice had dragged her out of bed, Taryn was alone. She wandered to the window instead of the bed, watching waves break against the rocks far below, trying to make sense of a night that had turned her entire life upside down. Somewhere in Boston, her aunt was likely still dealing with Caspian's men, still signing away whatever remained of the mess she'd created. And somewhere in this house, the man responsible for uprooting her entire existence in a single night was apparently just as invested in making sure she felt safe as he'd been in settling her aunt's debts. None of it made sense yet, but standing there, wrapped in a stranger's coat, looking out over an ocean she'd never expected to see, Taryn felt something she hadn't expected to feel after a night like the one she'd survived. Curiosity instead of fear. She found Caspian later that afternoon on a stone terrace behind the house, phone pressed to his ear, voice low and clipped as he spoke with someone about wire transfers and account closures. He ended the call the moment he saw her approach, sliding the phone into his pocket like the conversation had never happened. "Sleep well?" "Better than I expected." She wrapped her arms around herself, the ocean wind sharper out here than it had looked from her window. "You still haven't told me why. Why you did any of this. Why you even knew who I was." Something shifted behind his eyes, something careful and deliberate, like he'd been waiting for this exact question and had already decided how much of the truth she was ready to hear. "Tomorrow," he said gently, "I'll tell you everything tomorrow, over tea. Tonight, just rest. You've earned that much." True to his word, Caspian sent word the next afternoon that he'd like to speak with her, and Taryn found herself walking into a study she hadn't yet seen, tucked behind the main sitting room, its walls lined floor to ceiling with old books and framed photographs that looked decades old. A tea service sat waiting on a low table between two armchairs, positioned to face the window and the ocean beyond it. "Please, sit," Caspian said, gesturing to the chair across from his. He looked different in daylight, less like the composed stranger from the driveway, and more like someone bracing himself for a conversation he'd rehearsed many times, but never actually had to give. Taryn sat, smoothing her hands over her lap. "You said you'd explain everything today." "I did." He poured tea for both of them, more out of habit than ceremony, his hands steady despite whatever was clearly weighing on him. "I need you to understand something first. What I'm about to tell you isn't about your aunt, or her debts, or anything that happened in that driveway 2 nights ago. It's older than that. Older than you, actually. Okay? Your father, Arthur Holloway." He said the name carefully, watching her face for a reaction. "Did he ever mention a man named Edmund Hayes?" Taryn frowned, searching memories that felt distant now, her father having passed when she was only 12. I don't think so." "Why?" "Edmund Hayes was my father." Caspian set down his cup. 19 years ago, he owned a small hardware supply business outside Boston. It wasn't much, but it was everything he'd built from nothing, and it was about to collapse. A shipment fraud left him owing more than he could ever repay, and the bank was 3 weeks from seizing everything: the shop, the building, our house. Taryn stayed quiet, sensing this was a story he needed to tell without interruption. "Your father was one of his suppliers. Not a close friend, not family, just a man he did business with a few times a year. But when word got around that my father was about to lose everything, most people who owed him favors disappeared. Your father didn't." Caspian's voice thinned slightly, the memory clearly still raw despite the years. He co-signed a loan that saved the business, no paperwork requiring it, no benefit to himself. He just did it, because he said no man should lose his life's work over one bad shipment. "I didn't know any of this," Taryn whispered. "I was 7. I don't remember much of it firsthand, but I remember my father telling that story every year, on the anniversary of the day the bank backed off. He kept a photograph of the two of them together, taken outside the old shop." Caspian reached into a drawer in the side table and pulled out a small, worn photograph, sliding it across to her. "He made me promise, before he passed, that if the Holloway family ever needed help, I wouldn't hesitate." Taryn stared at the photograph. 2 younger men, standing outside a modest storefront, both smiling, one of them unmistakably a version of her father, She barely remembered, younger and lighter than the man who'd raised her in his final years. So when I heard your aunt was quietly shopping around loans using your name and your father's remaining estate assets as leverage, Caspian continued, I made sure I was the one who got the call. I bought up her debts before anyone else could. I wasn't going to let strangers decide what happened to Arthur Holloway's daughter. Taryn's throat tightened, tears pricking unexpectedly at the corners of her eyes. She never told me any of this, about the assets, about what she was doing behind my back. She probably didn't want you to know she'd been quietly liquidating what your father left you for over a year. Caspian's jaw tightened again, that same flash of controlled anger she'd seen the night before. There wasn't much left by the time I stepped in, but there's enough, and what's left is protected now, legally, permanently, in your name only. Why didn't you just tell me all this in the driveway? Or on the drive up here? Taryn asked, setting the photograph down carefully like it might break. Why let me think I was being handed over like property? Because your aunt believed that's exactly what was happening, and until my lawyers finalized everything, I needed her to keep believing it. If she suspected for one moment that I intended to protect you instead of collect on a debt, she would have panicked and hidden the remaining assets somewhere I couldn't trace them. He looked almost apologetic, the first real vulnerability she'd seen from him. I'm sorry for how frightening that must have been. That was never the intention. Taryn sat with that for a long moment, turning the photograph over in her hands, trying to reconcile the small kindness her father had shown a stranger decades ago with the very large kindness now being returned to her without her ever having asked for it. What happens now? She finally asked. Now you have options you didn't have 2 days ago. A place to stay for as long as you need it. Resources to rebuild whatever your aunt took from you. And no obligation to any of it. Not to me, not to my father's memory, nothing. He met her eyes steadily. This was never a transaction, Taryn. I wanted you to understand that before anything else. Outside the window, the tide had begun pulling back from the rocks, exposing dark stone slick with salt water. And Taryn realized, sitting in that quiet study with a photograph of 2 men who'd shaped both their lives without either of them fully realizing it, that the fear she'd carried since the driveway had finally, quietly, begun to loosen its grip. By the 5th day, Taryn had settled into a rhythm she hadn't expected to find so quickly. Mornings on the terrace with tea, long walks along the cliffside path, with Mrs. Gable pointing out which rocks were safe to climb and which weren't. Afternoons spent slowly working through the box of her father's old papers that Caspian's assistant had recovered from a storage unit Beatrice had apparently forgotten to sell off. So when Caspian mentioned over breakfast that he had a meeting in Portland and asked if she'd like to come along, Taryn said yes before she'd even fully thought it through. You don't have to sit through anything boring, he said, glancing at her as the car pulled out of the manor's gates. But I thought you might want to see where I actually spend most of my time. It's not all driveways and debt settlements. I'd like that. She smoothed the front of the blouse Mrs. Gable had helped her pick out that morning, still not quite used to clothes that weren't borrowed or second-hand. Honestly, I think I need to see something that isn't the ocean or a stack of old paperwork. The office turned out to be nothing like what Taryn had pictured. She'd braced herself, somewhere in the back of her mind, for something colder, glass and steel, and men in dark suits speaking in hushed, threatening tones. Instead, the building sat in the middle of Portland's financial district, unassuming from the outside, and inside it hummed with the ordinary energy of any working office. Phones ringing, people moving between desks with coffee cups and folders, a receptionist who greeted Caspian by name and asked about his weekend like he was any other boss coming back from time off. "This is the regional office," Caspian explained, guiding her through the floor. "Logistics, shipping contracts, warehouse coordination. Less glamorous than people assume." "I didn't realize you ran an actual business. I thought—" She hesitated, unsure how to phrase it without sounding rude. "You thought it was all collections and debt settlements." He almost smiled. "That's a small part of what I do. Necessary, sometimes, but not the whole picture. Most days look like this." He led her into a conference room where two men were already waiting, spreading papers across the table. Taryn took a seat near the window, expecting to be quietly ignored for the next hour. But Caspian surprised her by pulling out the chair beside his own. "Sit here," he said simply. "I want you to see how this works, if you're interested." She was more interested than she expected to be. The conversation moved quickly, contracts and freight schedules, and disputes over a shipment that had been delayed at a port somewhere she'd never heard of. But what struck her most wasn't the content of the meeting. It was watching Caspian navigate it. Firm but fair, direct but never cruel. When one of the men suggested cutting corners on a safety inspection to save time on a delayed shipment, Caspian shut the idea down without raising his voice, simply stating that the company didn't operate that way and never would, regardless of the cost. "We're not losing our reputation over 3 days," he said, and that was the end of the discussion. Afterward, as they walked down toward the lobby, Taryn found herself watching him differently than she had that first night in the driveway. "You turned down a shortcut that would have saved you real money." Cutting corners costs more in the long run, usually in ways you can't put a number on. He held the door for her as they stepped out onto the street. "My father used to say, a business built on shortcuts eventually collapses under its own weight. I've never found a reason to disagree with him." They walked a few blocks in comfortable quiet before Caspian stopped outside a smaller building tucked between a bakery and a bookshop, its windows displaying neat rows of office furniture and a small sign advertising available leases. "I mentioned it briefly before, but I meant it seriously," he said, nodding toward the building. "There's an administrative position open here, managing scheduling and client correspondence for one of my smaller divisions. It pays well, the hours are reasonable, and it would be entirely yours. Nothing tied to me personally, nothing owed." Taryn stared at the building, something warm and unfamiliar settling in her chest. "You're offering me a job. I'm offering you independence, if you want it. You don't have to answer today." He studied her carefully. "I just don't want you to feel like your only options are staying at the manor indefinitely, or going back to whatever was left behind in Boston. Why does it matter to you so much? My independence, I mean." She turned to face him fully. "You've already done more than enough. The debts, the manor, all of it." Something flickered across his face, quick and difficult to name, gone before she could study it properly. "Because a debt this old deserves to be repaid properly. Not with charity that keeps someone dependent, but with something that actually gives them a life back." Taryn didn't answer right away, turning the offer over in her mind as they continued walking toward the car. It was strange, she thought, how quickly the ground beneath her had shifted twice now in less than a week. First pulled entirely out from under her in a dark driveway, and now steadying itself into something that almost resembled a future. By the time they reached the car, she still hadn't given him an answer. But for the first time since Beatrice had dragged her out of bed, the silence between them didn't feel uncertain. It felt like the beginning of something she was allowed to choose for herself. The following week fell into an easier pattern than Taryn could have imagined possible only days earlier. She'd started spending mornings reading through the shipping schedules Caspian left on the study desk, half out of curiosity, half because she was seriously considering the job offer in Portland. In the afternoons, she and Caspian had taken to walking the path that wound down from the manor toward the small commercial harbor below the cliffs, watching fishing boats come and go while he pointed out which crews he'd known for years and which ones were newer to the docks. It was during one of those walks, the wind sharper than usual off the water, that Taryn first noticed the black sedan parked at the edge of the public lot. "That car's been sitting there since we arrived," she said quietly, nodding toward it without pointing. Caspian's expression shifted immediately, the easy warmth from a moment ago replaced by something more alert. "Stay close to me." Before she could ask why, 3 men stepped out of the sedan. The one in front wore a gray overcoat that looked expensive in a way that tried too hard, and his smile, when he spotted them, had nothing friendly in it. "Caspian Hayes," the man's voice carried easily across the dock. "I was starting to think you were avoiding me." "Garrick." Caspian's tone flattened into something Taryn hadn't heard from him before, controlled but edged with warning. "I wasn't aware we had anything left to discuss." "That's funny, because I hear you settled a rather significant debt on behalf of Arthur Holloway's estate." Garrick's eyes slid toward Taryn, assessing her the way someone might assess a piece of paperwork rather than a person, and Taryn felt her skin crawl under the attention. "Property titles that, as I understand it, were also promised to me as part of a separate arrangement with Beatrice Holloway. Then you understand incorrectly." Caspian stepped slightly in front of Taryn without making it obvious, angling his body just enough to put himself between her and the 3 men. "Beatrice's arrangements with you were never legally binding, and even if they had been, they're irrelevant now. Every asset tied to the Holloway estate belongs solely to Taryn." "That's not how I heard it." Garrick's men shifted closer, and one of them reached into his coat, not drawing anything, just resting a hand there. A small gesture meant to unsettle, rather than threaten outright. "Beatrice signed documents, promising me first right to those titles, months before you swept in and bought her out from under me." "Then take it up with her." Caspian's voice didn't rise, but something in it had gone hard as stone. "Because those documents, if they exist, were signed against assets she had no legal authority to promise anyone. You'd be suing over paper that was never worth the ink." Garrick studied him for a long moment, clearly recalculating. Taryn stood frozen behind Caspian, heart hammering, watching this exchange happen with a strange, distant clarity, like she was observing it from somewhere outside her own body. "You're awfully confident for a man who just inherited someone else's mess," Garrick said finally. "I'm confident because my lawyers filed the full transfer of ownership 4 days ago, retroactive to the night I settled her debts." Caspian didn't blink. "Every document you're holding is worthless. If you'd like to test that in court, I'd welcome it. I have significantly more time and significantly more money than you do." For a moment, nobody moved. The wind off the water was the only sound. Gulls crying somewhere above the docked boats, the low creak of ropes against wooden posts. Then Garrick's smile faltered, just slightly, just enough for Taryn to see the bluff cracking beneath it. "This isn't over," Garrick muttered, though the certainty had drained from his voice. "It is, actually." Caspian's tone remained perfectly level, but if you'd like to keep testing that theory, feel free to have your lawyers contact mine. I'll make sure they're prepared for how quickly this conversation will end. Garrick held his gaze a moment longer, searching for some crack in Caspian's composure, some sign of weakness he could exploit. He didn't find one. Without another word, he turned and walked back toward the sedan, his men falling into step behind him, and within a minute, the car was pulling out of the lot, gravel crunching under its tires as it disappeared down the coastal road. Taryn let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "Who was that?" "One of your aunt's other creditors. He's been trying to claim pieces of the estate she promised him before I intervened." Caspian turned to face her fully, and for the first time since the confrontation began, some of the tension left his shoulders. "He won't get anywhere. Everything's airtight, but I'm sorry you had to see that." "Don't be." Taryn wrapped her arms around herself, still shaking slightly from adrenaline. "I think I needed to see it, actually, to understand how much she was willing to sell off without telling me. There's more of them out there. People she made promises to that she never had the right to make." Caspian's jaw tightened, that familiar flash of restrained anger surfacing again. "I'd like to finish tracking all of it down, so nobody else shows up at a dock or a driveway thinking they have a claim to your life." "Thank you," Taryn said quietly, meaning it more than she expected to, "for stepping in front of me like that. You didn't have to." "I did, actually." He held her gaze a moment longer than necessary before glancing back toward the harbor, watching the last of the boats settle in for the evening. "I meant what I told you the first night. Nobody gets to treat you like leverage. Not your aunt, not men like Garrick, not anyone." They walked back up toward the manor in silence, the confrontation still humming beneath the surface of the quiet evening. But underneath the lingering fear, Taryn noticed something else settling into place. She hadn't felt safe like this in longer than she could remember, and stranger still, she was starting to realize how much that safety had nothing to do with the manor, the money, or the debts that had been settled. It had everything to do with the man walking quietly beside her. The knock came just after 7, sharp and insistent against the study door, and Mrs. Gable's voice carried an urgency Taryn hadn't heard from her before. "Mr. Hayes, there's someone at the east gate causing a scene. Security's holding her there, but she's demanding to speak with you directly." Caspian set down the papers he'd been reviewing, and something in his expression told Taryn, even before he said the name, exactly who was waiting outside. "Beatrice," he said, standing. Taryn's stomach dropped. She hadn't seen her aunt since the driveway, hadn't spoken to her, hadn't even allowed herself to think much about what Beatrice might be doing now that her debts had been settled without her getting anything close to what she'd expected in return. Some part of her had assumed the woman would simply disappear into whatever life remained for her, chastened and quiet. She should have known better. "I want to come with you," Taryn said, already on her feet. "You don't have to. I can handle this." "I know you can, but she's still my aunt, and I think I need to hear whatever she's come to say." Taryn's voice was steadier than she expected, some of the fear from the driveway, replaced now with something closer to resolve. "I'm not scared of her anymore." Caspian studied her for a moment, then nodded, and together they walked out through the side entrance toward the east gate, where 2 of his security men stood blocking Beatrice's path onto the property. She looked different than Taryn remembered, thinner, more disheveled, her usual sharp composure fraying at the edges. Whatever calm confidence she'd carried into that driveway a week and a half ago had clearly worn thin. Taryn. Beatrice's eyes lit up the moment she spotted her niece, some desperate hope flickering across her face. "Thank God. I need to talk to you. Alone. Whatever you have to say, you can say here." Caspian's voice was even, but there was no warmth in it now, none of the gentleness Taryn had grown used to over the past week. "This isn't your business, Mr. Hayes. This is between family." Beatrice's eyes narrowed, some of her old sharpness returning. "You've taken everything from me. My assets, my leverage, even my niece, and you've turned her against me in the process." "Nobody turned me against you." Taryn's voice cracked slightly, but she held her ground. "You did that yourself. The moment you tried to hand me off to a stranger to cover a debt you created. I did what I had to do to survive." Beatrice's tone shifted, softening into something that might have worked on Taryn a week ago, before she'd seen exactly how far her aunt was willing to go. "You don't understand the pressure I was under, and now, thanks to him, I have nothing left. No house, no assets, nothing. You have your freedom," Caspian said flatly. "And considering what you attempted to do with your niece, that's more mercy than most people would have shown you." Beatrice's expression twisted, desperation curdling into something colder. "I know things about your business, Mr. Hayes. Things reporters would love to hear about. Ways your money moves that wouldn't hold up under a closer look. I've made some calls already. I'm sure you can imagine how quickly a story like that could spread." The threat hung in the cool evening air, and Taryn felt her chest tighten, waiting for Caspian's reaction. But he didn't flinch. If anything, something almost like disappointment crossed his face, like he'd expected this exact move and was simply sorry to see it confirmed. "You're welcome to try that," he said quietly. "But before you make any more calls, you should know that every transaction tied to your niece's estate has been documented and filed with the state, exactly as the law requires. There's nothing to expose, Beatrice, because there's nothing to hide. If anything, a story like that would only draw more attention to your own financial history, which I'd imagine you'd prefer stayed quiet." Beatrice's confidence faltered, just as Garrick's had at the harbor days earlier, the same desperate bluff crumbling under the weight of a truth she hadn't accounted for. "You'd really let a reporter dig through everything?" she asked, her voice smaller now. "I welcome it." Caspian reached into his coat and produced a folded document, extending it toward one of his security men rather than handing it directly to Beatrice. "This is a formal cease and desist notice. It outlines the consequences of any further attempts to contact Taryn, trespass on this property, or make false claims to media outlets regarding either of our finances. If you violate any part of it, I will pursue prosecution to the fullest extent the law allows. No more warnings after this." Beatrice stared at the paper, then at Taryn, something desperate and pleading in her expression. "Taryn, please, I raised you. Doesn't that count for something?" Taryn felt the old guilt rise in her chest. The years of obligation Beatrice had woven into every interaction since her father's death. But this time, it didn't take hold the way it once might have. "You raised me, and then you tried to sell me to settle a debt. I don't think I owe you anything anymore, Aunt B." Not after that. For a long moment, Beatrice said nothing, the fight visibly draining out of her. Then, without another word, she turned and walked back toward the road, shoulders hunched against the wind, the security men watching, until her car pulled away and disappeared around the bend. Taryn stood there long after the taillights vanished, feeling something loosen in her chest that had been tight since the night in the driveway. Beside her, Caspian remained quiet, giving her space to process whatever she needed to. "I'm sorry you had to hear all that," he finally said. "Don't be." Taryn exhaled slowly, watching the last light fade over the water. "I think I needed to hear it, to know for certain that walking away from her was the right choice." 2 days after Beatrice's visit to the gate, Caspian asked Taryn to come with him to Boston for what he called a formal accounting meeting. He didn't elaborate much beyond that, only that his legal team had finished compiling everything related to her father's estate and wanted to walk her through it in person. The drive back into the city felt strange after almost 2 weeks at the manor. Boston looked the same as it always had, gray buildings and busy streets, but Taryn felt like a different person moving through it, than the one who'd been dragged out of her bed in the middle of the night. She caught herself watching the familiar streets pass by with a kind of distance, like she was visiting a life that no longer quite belonged to her. The office they arrived at sat on the 9th floor of a building downtown, far removed from the docks and driveways where most of her interactions with Caspian's world had taken place so far. Inside, 2 auditors were already waiting at a long conference table, folders and printed statements stacked neatly in front of them. Ms. Holloway, the older of the 2, a woman with silver-rimmed glasses and a calm, professional manner, gestured to the seat across from her. "We've spent the last week and a half reconstructing your father's estate records, along with everything your aunt filed on your behalf over the past several years. I think it's important you see all of it, not just the summary." Taryn sat, glancing at Caspian, who took the seat beside her without a word, present but letting the auditors lead. "Your father left a modest but stable trust when he passed," the woman continued, sliding a folder across the table. "Property in Dedham, a small investment account, and rights to a family cabin near Lake Winnipesaukee. All of it was meant to transfer fully into your control once you turned 25, with your aunt managing it as trustee until then." "That much I knew," Taryn said quietly, flipping through the folder. "What you likely didn't know," the second auditor added, sliding another set of documents forward, "is that your aunt began drawing against that trust almost 3 years ago, small withdrawals at first, listed as management fees, then larger ones, tied to loans she took out using the Dedham property and the cabin as collateral." Taryn's stomach turned as she scanned the numbers, watching years of small, quiet thefts stack up into something much larger than she'd ever imagined. "She used my father's cabin as collateral, the one he took me to every summer." "She did," Caspian said, his voice low. "It was sold at a fraction of its value 8 months ago to cover a gambling debt one of her associates was pressuring her over. I didn't even know it was gone." Taryn's hands tightened around the folder. "She let me think it was still there. She let me believe I still had somewhere to go back to." "I'm sorry," the auditor said gently. "There's no way to soften numbers like these, but I can tell you that everything remaining, the Dedham property, what's left of the investment account, and the full value owed to you from the cabin's undervalued sale, has been legally secured in your name as of this week. Mr. Hayes covered the difference on the cabin's sale price out of pocket to ensure you weren't left with a loss stemming from fraud." Taryn looked up sharply at Caspian. "You paid the difference?" "It wasn't right that she profited from selling something under its value while you had no idea it was even happening." He said it simply, without any expectation of gratitude. "That money belongs to you. I just made sure the number reflected what it should have been." The auditors continued walking her through the rest of the documents, explaining how the formal filing would protect everything from any future claims, how Beatrice's name had been permanently removed from every account tied to the estate, how the report itself would serve as legal proof, if ever needed, of the fraud that had taken place. Taryn listened, absorbing more than she thought she could hold, the full scope of what her aunt had done, slowly settling into something heavier than anger. It wasn't just betrayal, it was years of quiet, careful theft, dressed up as guardianship. When the meeting finally ended, Taryn stepped out into the hallway ahead of Caspian, needing a moment to breathe before facing the elevator ride back down. He gave her the space without being asked, standing a respectful distance away, waiting. "I keep thinking I should feel more angry," she admitted after a while. "But mostly, I just feel tired, like I spent years assuming she was doing her best for me, and the whole time, she was quietly taking everything apart behind my back. That kind of exhaustion makes sense. Caspian's voice was quiet, careful. Anger usually comes first, when something happens fast, like the driveway. This is different. This is grief for a version of her you thought existed and never really did. Taryn glanced at him, surprised by how precisely he'd named the feeling she hadn't been able to put into words herself. How do you know that? Because I watched my father go through something similar, years after the bank backed off, when he discovered a business partner he'd trusted for a decade had been skimming from their shared accounts the entire time. Caspian's expression softened with the memory. It's not the sudden betrayals that hurt the most. It's the slow ones you don't see, until someone hands you the paperwork. They stood together in the quiet hallway for a moment longer, the weight of the morning settling around them, before Caspian finally spoke again. Whatever you decide to do next, the job in Portland, the property in Dedham, all of it is entirely yours now. No conditions, no strings, nothing tied back to me. He met her eyes steadily. I just wanted you to have the full truth before you decided anything. Taryn nodded slowly, the folder of documents heavy in her hands, and for the first time since the driveway, she felt something settle into place that wasn't fear or grief or exhaustion. It felt unmistakably like the beginning of choosing her own future. The invitation sat on Taryn's bed when she returned from her afternoon walk, a cream envelope with her name written in careful script, and inside it, a single card announcing the annual Maritime Trade Gala hosted at a venue in Portsmouth she'd never heard of. She was still staring at it when Mrs. Gable appeared in the doorway, a garment bag draped over her arm. "Mr. Hayes asked me to help you pick something out for tomorrow evening," Mrs. Gable said, hanging the bag on the closet door. "He said it's entirely your choice whether you attend, but I suspect he'd like the company." Taryn had heard about the gala in passing, some annual event Caspian hosted for business associates and trade partners along the coast, but she hadn't expected to be included in it. "Doesn't he usually go to these things alone? Not once in the 11 years I've worked for him has he asked anyone to accompany him." Mrs. Gable unzipped the bag, revealing a deep green dress that caught the light. "Make of that what you will, dear." The venue, when they arrived the following evening, sat right along the water, its wide windows overlooking Portsmouth's harbor, boats lit up with strings of lights, bobbing gently in the dark water beyond. Taryn had expected something colder, stiffer, full of the kind of guarded conversations she imagined belonged to men who ran shipping empires and settled debts in gravel driveways. Instead, the room buzzed with easy laughter, clinking glasses, and genuine warmth that surprised her at every turn. Caspian kept close to her side as they moved through the crowd, introducing her without hesitation to partners and associates whose names she immediately forgot, too distracted by the way he spoke about her. "This is Taryn Holloway," he said to an older man with silver hair and a booming laugh. "She's been advising on our coastal expansion into administrative logistics. I wouldn't be surprised if she's running half the Portland office within a year." The man's eyebrows lifted with genuine interest, and he launched into a conversation about shipping routes that Taryn found herself keeping up with far better than she expected, thanks to 2 weeks spent quietly reading through schedules at the Manor's study desk. By the time they moved on, she caught Caspian watching her with something unmistakably proud in his expression. "You didn't have to introduce me like that," she murmured as they stepped toward the open bar. "Like I actually work for you." "You will, if you take the job." His voice was low, meant only for her. "And even if you don't, I wanted everyone in this room to understand exactly how much I respect you, not as a favor I'm doing or a debt I'm settling, as someone whose opinion I actually value." Before Taryn could respond, a woman in a sharp navy dress approached, her smile polite, but her eyes calculating in a way that made Taryn instinctively straighten her spine. Caspian. The woman's gaze slid toward Taryn with obvious curiosity. I don't believe we've met your guest before. Vivian Cross. This is Taryn Holloway. Caspian's tone stayed easy, but there was something protective in the way he shifted slightly closer to Taryn's side. She'll be joining our Portland division soon, overseeing client scheduling for the coastal accounts. How lovely. Vivian's smile sharpened at the edges. I don't recall you ever bringing an employee to one of these events before, Caspian. Or is there more to this arrangement than business? The question hung in the air, pointed and deliberately probing, and Taryn felt heat rise to her cheeks, unsure how to navigate the sudden scrutiny. But Caspian didn't hesitate. Taryn's presence tonight is exactly what it looks like. Someone I respect enormously, whose insight has already improved how we're handling the coastal contracts. He held Vivian's gaze evenly. Whether there's more to it beyond that isn't really any of the room's business, is it? Vivian's smile faltered slightly at the deflection, clearly unused to being met with anything less than full transparency from him. But she recovered quickly, offering a tight nod before excusing herself toward another cluster of guests. I'm sorry about that, Caspian said, once she was out of earshot. Vivian's known for digging for gossip. Don't let it bother you. It's fine. Taryn managed a small laugh, though her heart was still racing from the exchange. I think I'm getting used to being asked uncomfortable questions this month. They spent the rest of the evening moving easily between conversations, Taryn growing more confident with every introduction, until the crowd began thinning and the harbor outside grew quiet beneath the moonlight. Caspian led her out to a small balcony overlooking the water, the noise of the gala fading behind them. Thank you for coming tonight, he said, leaning against the railing beside her. I know it wasn't an easy room to walk into. I think I needed it, actually. Taryn watched the boats bob gently on the water, string lights reflecting in broken patterns across the surface. A few weeks ago, I couldn't have imagined standing in a room like that and holding my own in a conversation about shipping contracts. Now it feels like maybe I actually could build a life around all of this, if I wanted to. You could. Caspian turned to face her fully, something quiet and certain in his expression. You're capable of far more than your aunt ever gave you credit for. I think some part of you has known that for a while now. You just needed the room to prove it to yourself. Taryn met his eyes, the space between them narrowing without either of them quite meaning it to, the warmth of the evening settling into something that felt less like gratitude now and more like the early edges of something else entirely. Neither of them moved to close the distance, not yet, but the quiet understanding passing between them made one thing clear. Whatever this had started as, in a dark driveway 2 weeks ago, it had become something neither of them had fully expected. The courthouse in Portland looked smaller than Taryn had imagined. A plain brick building tucked between a parking garage and a row of coffee shops, nothing about it suggesting the weight of what was about to happen inside its walls. She stood on the steps beside Caspian, smoothing the front of her coat, watching lawyers and clerks move briskly past them through the morning cold. You don't have to go in if you're not ready, Caspian said quietly. The auditors can represent the estate's position without you present. I want to be there. Taryn's voice was steady, steadier than she expected after 2 weeks of turning this exact morning over in her mind. I need to see this finished. All of it. Inside, the courtroom was smaller and quieter than television had ever led her to believe, just a handful of people scattered across the benches, a judge reviewing documents at a raised desk, and Beatrice seated at a table near the front, beside a lawyer who looked, even from a distance, like he'd rather be anywhere else. Taryn hadn't seen her aunt since the confrontation at the gate weeks earlier, and the sight of her now, smaller somehow, her usual sharp composure entirely gone, stirred something complicated in Taryn's chest. Not the fear from the driveway, and not quite the anger from the auditor's office either. Something closer to a strange, quiet sadness for the woman who had raised her and then dismantled everything her father had left behind, piece by piece, without ever once looking back. The proceedings moved faster than Taryn expected. The judge reviewed the documentation the auditors had compiled, the withdrawal records, the falsified management fees, the undervalued sale of the cabin, each piece laid out with a clarity that left little room for argument. Beatrice's lawyer attempted a defense built around financial hardship and desperation, but the paper trail told a story too consistent, too deliberate, to be explained away as panic. The court finds sufficient evidence of fraudulent mismanagement, of trust assets belonging to Taryn Holloway, the judge said finally, her voice even and unhurried. Beatrice Holloway is permanently barred from any further claim, control, or involvement in the Holloway estate, effective immediately. Restitution proceedings will follow separately regarding the undervalued sale of the Winnipesaukee property. Beatrice didn't turn around, didn't look for Taryn among the benches, just sat with her shoulders bowed forward, staring at the table in front of her, like the weight of the ruling had physically settled onto it. For a moment, Taryn almost felt sorry for her. Almost. Then she remembered the driveway. The folder of papers thrust toward Caspian like Taryn herself was simply another asset to be traded away. The cabin, gone without a word, while Beatrice let her believe it was still waiting for them both to visit again someday. The sympathy didn't disappear entirely, but it settled into something quieter, something that no longer asked anything of her. Outside the courthouse afterward, the cold air felt sharper than it had on the way in, but cleaner too, like something heavy had finally lifted. Caspian stood beside her on the steps, a folder of his own tucked under one arm. "It's done," he said. "Every asset, every account, everything that belongs to you is fully secured now. No further claims, no loose ends." He handed her the folder, and Taryn opened it slowly, scanning the documents inside. Deeds, account transfers, the finalized report from the auditors, each page representing weeks of careful, deliberate work done entirely on her behalf. "I don't know how to thank you for all of this," she said quietly. "Any of it. You don't need to thank me." Caspian's voice was warm, steady in the way it had been since that very first night in the driveway. "This was never a debt you owed me. If anything, I've spent the last 2 weeks trying to repay one my own family owed yours." Taryn closed the folder, holding it against her chest, watching the courthouse steps empty out around them as other cases and other lives moved forward without pause. What happens to her now? Beatrice? She'll face separate restitution proceedings for the cabin. Beyond that, I don't know, and honestly, it's no longer either of our concern. Caspian's expression softened slightly, watching Taryn carefully. "You don't owe her anything else. Not forgiveness, not distance, not even anger, if you don't want to carry it anymore. I think I'm still figuring out what I feel." Taryn looked out toward the street, watching cars move past in the late morning light. "But it's not fear anymore. Not since the driveway. I think that's the first thing that's actually changed." They walked together down the courthouse steps, the folder of documents heavy and real in Taryn's hands, proof of an entire life quietly rebuilt from the wreckage her aunt had left behind. Somewhere behind them, inside that small brick building, the last legal tie to the woman who had raised her was finally, permanently severed. Ahead of her, for the first time since her father had passed all those years ago, stretched something that actually resembled a future she was allowed to choose for herself. Caspian walked beside her, in comfortable silence, no longer just the man who had appeared in a dark driveway to settle an old debt, but something steadier now, something that had grown quietly over 2 short weeks into a presence Taryn wasn't sure she wanted to imagine her life without. Neither of them said it out loud, not yet. But as they reached the car and the late morning sun broke fully through the clouds overhead, the unspoken understanding between them felt every bit as certain as the documents tucked safely in Taryn's hands. The evening light had turned gold by the time Caspian asked Taryn to walk with him along the cliffside path, the same one she'd wandered alone that first exhausted morning at the manor, though nothing about her felt like that frightened stranger anymore. 3 days had passed since the courthouse, 3 days of quiet mornings and long conversations that had nothing to do with debts or estates or anything her aunt had left broken behind her. "There's something I want to show you," Caspian said, leading her past the usual turn toward the harbor, up a narrower trail she hadn't explored yet, one that climbed higher along the rocks until the entire coastline opened up beneath them, the water catching fire under the setting sun. "I didn't know this was here." Taryn stopped, breathless, taking in the view. "It's beautiful. I used to come up here when I was small, whenever my father brought us to Rockport." Caspian stood beside her, hands in his coat pockets, watching the horizon rather than her. "It's where he told me the story about your father for the first time. About the loan, about the shop, about the kind of man who helps someone without expecting anything back." Taryn glanced at him, something warm settling behind her ribs. "I think about that a lot, how something my father did before I was even born ended up changing my entire life 2 decades later. I think about it too." Caspian reached into his coat and pulled out a folded set of papers, different from the ones at the courthouse, newer, crisper, "which is part of why I wanted to bring you up here today." He handed them to her, and Taryn unfolded the pages slowly, scanning the header before the meaning fully registered. A property deed, a small house, modest compared to the manor, situated along the very stretch of coastline they were standing above, fully paid, fully hers. "Caspian, I don't understand. I already have the Dedham house, the investment account. You've done more than enough already. This isn't about debts anymore." His voice was quieter now, more careful than she'd ever heard it. "This is something separate, something I wanted to give you, not because of your father, not because of anything owed, because I wanted you to have a place of your own here, close enough to choose whether you ever wanted to see me again, but never obligated to." Taryn looked up at him, the papers trembling slightly in her hands, not from the cold. "Why would I not want to see you again? Because everything between us started under circumstances you never chose. A debt, a driveway, a stranger who showed up in the middle of the night and turned your whole life upside down." Caspian finally met her eyes fully, something raw and unguarded there that she hadn't seen from him even at his most vulnerable moments over the past 2 weeks. "I never wanted you to feel like staying close to me, or caring about me, was another obligation stacked on top of everything else you've had taken from you. I wanted you to have the freedom to walk away completely, if that's what you needed." The wind pulled at her hair, salt air thick around them, and Taryn folded the deed carefully before tucking it against her chest, the weight of it grounding her in a way that felt entirely different from every other document she'd signed or received over the past 2 weeks. "I don't want to walk away," she said quietly. "I think I've known that for a while now, maybe since the harbor, watching you stand between me and a man who wanted to hurt us. Maybe since the study, when you told me about our fathers, and I realized you'd spent your whole life carrying a promise most people would have forgotten. Taryn, let me finish. She managed a small, unsteady laugh, nerves and certainty tangled together in her chest. I came here 2 weeks ago with nothing. No home, no money, no idea who I even was, outside of being someone my aunt used and discarded. And somehow, in the middle of all that, I found something I never expected to find. Not just safety, not just independence. You. Caspian's expression shifted, something unguarded breaking loose behind his careful composure, and for the first time since the driveway, Taryn watched him look at her without any distance between them at all. I meant what I said that first night, he told her, voice low. You were never a debt to be settled, but somewhere along the way, without either of us planning it, you became something I wasn't prepared for, something I don't want to walk away from, either. The space between them narrowed slowly, deliberately, until there was nothing left but the sound of waves breaking far below and the last warm light of the evening settling over the water. When he finally closed the distance and kissed her, gentle and certain, Taryn felt every fragment of fear from that dark driveway finally, completely dissolve. They stood together on the cliff, long after the sun dipped below the horizon, the deed to her new home tucked safely between them, the promise of an entire future stretching out ahead like the coastline itself, unbroken and hers to choose. Somewhere behind them, back in Boston, Beatrice Holloway was left facing the consequences of every choice she'd made, alone with whatever remained of a life built on other people's inheritance. But up on that cliff, none of that mattered anymore. Taryn Holloway, once traded away in a midnight driveway like a debt to be paid, stood instead as an equal beside the man who had chosen, from the very beginning, to give her back everything her aunt had tried to take. Not out of obligation, out of love that had been building, quietly and honestly, since the very first night he'd handed her his coat and asked for nothing in return.